Hi. So today, to finish off this little mini series on mental health conditions, mental health problems, I want to talk about something called dissociative identity disorder. Now, dissociation and dissociative identity disorder, or DID, as I think we'll say through this because it's shorter, um, may well be something that you don't know about. You'll probably only know about it if you actually have it yourself or you know somebody who does. And as a doctor, I didn't know about it either for many, many years. I wasn't taught about it at medical school. Um, and I think a lot of doctors nowadays still don't fully understand DID or may not have had a patient where they have it and are aware of it. Um, so I think it's helpful to understand it. I think there's more of it than we realise, and understanding it means that we can actually help those people who struggle with it. So I came to find out about DID, actually not from a patient. It was from somebody that I met in the Netherlands. And we met a lady there about 15, 20 years ago now, and she had DID. And through her story and talking with her, I started to understand what it is and how people can be helped. So DID is actually something really creative. It's a way that a person can survive really severe trauma or abuse and carry on functioning in a meaningful way, even though that abuse is probably still ongoing. I suppose you could say it's a God-given creative way of that person surviving something really traumatic that's happening to them. It's nearly always linked with abuse, but not always. It's linked with something very traumatic that's happened for that person. And when trauma happens, when abuse happens, a person, it's very difficult for a person to deal with all the emotions and the pain, the physical pain, the emotional pain, the mental pain that comes as part of that trauma or abuse. And so dissociation is a way of that person managing it. And by dissociation, we mean separating part of ourselves off, so the person separating part of themselves off to hold the pain of the abuse, to hold an emotion, to hold something that happens in that traumatic experience, so that they can then go back to the core personality and carry on functioning. So, for example, in severe abuse, there may be things like shock, fear of death, even pain, physical pain, emotional pain, mental pain, um, all sorts of emotions that come at the time of the abuse. And if those emotions carried on, that person, that child, wouldn't be able to carry on functioning back in their family or at school the next day. So if part of them can separate off, if part of the personality can separate off and hold the pain, hold the shock, hold the fear, then they can go back to being the core personality and leave that emotion with the part or the alternate personality, and carry on functioning in what can look like a very normal way. And then when the abuse happens again or the trauma happens again, they flip back into that alternate personality who then carries whatever it is that's happening at that particular time. Now, these alters or parts of the person may have names. They may be discrete personalities. So, one part may have a name and be quite boisterous or rebellious, or another part might be quite quiet or withdrawn. Another part might be very fearful or anxious. There may be a part who seems to be bossy and manage some of the other parts. Um, and the person, when they're flipped into that part, will seem like a different personality. So that's quite hard probably for us to imagine how that happens or what that's like. I mean, maybe to help with that, I find a way of describing it. So I suppose we all dissociate to a certain extent. So, for example, if I'm driving to work, and busy navigating all the traffic in the different roads and managing the car, I may be making a shopping list in my mind, for what I need for the rest of the week. And I'm perfectly able to safely navigate the driving while making a shopping list. So in a tiny way, you could say that I'm slightly dissociating. I'm slightly separating part of myself off, one to make the list and the other to drive. I mean, that's quite a simple example. DID is so much more complex and difficult than that. But we can almost see where it goes. We can almost see that can happen, that we can separate parts of ourself off. And I think another example can be maybe in childhood, not even with severe trauma and abuse. Something can happen to a child, something that shocks them, or maybe there's an accident, or maybe somebody says something, or there's some bullying. Maybe something happens with a parent at a certain age, and that child has quite a strong traumatic emotional experience at that age. And then as an adult, something similar happens. So, for example, it may be that there's a grown man who suddenly starts behaving like a young child. So in a certain situation, something just presses that trigger, something that may be the same environment or the same tone of voice, or somebody says something to that grown man that triggers that experience when that man was a child and had a very painful experience then. And they can behave in what seems like an inappropriate way, behaving like a child rather than like an adult, or behaving like a teenager rather than an adult, having a tantrum when they're a grown up. And that's a sort of similar kind of thing. There's part of that person that's got stuck at a certain age with something that happened, and it pops out as an adult in an unhelpful and what can be a seemingly inappropriate kind of way. Now with DID, it's even more than that, because you get these discrete personalities, discrete parts of a person, and they may not know what each other is doing. So when I learnt about this from this lady in the Netherlands, she described she'd had severe abuse, and she described how she realised that something wasn't right when she couldn't remember things that apparently she'd done. So somebody would say, I saw you at such and such a place yesterday, and she wasn't aware that she'd actually been to that place. Or she realised that it was now Thursday and she wasn't aware of what she'd actually done on Tuesday and Wednesday. She'd lost a period of time. And she found that there were things in her house that she'd bought and she couldn't remember buying them. So when she was functioning as one of these other personalities, the core personality, wasn't aware of what those other parts of her were doing. And that's scary and shocking for a person and difficult to manage. Now, actually, that's a protective thing. It's a creative, protective thing, but it's very difficult for that person as an adult to carry on functioning in that kind of way. And it can often be when one of these parts is in control of the person that they're actually behaving at a different age to the core person. So you can have a core person who's now an adult, who may be married and have children, but in a certain situation, something presses that trigger and they flip into a different personality, who then becomes maybe more rebellious or more fearful or more stroppy about something, uses a different tone of voice, a different kind of language, even different mannerisms, or dresses differently. And that can be very difficult for people around as well to understand what's going on. Now, because I got to learn about this, I became quite interested in it. And I think it's quite amazing how a person can do that to enable them to survive and enable them to function. And I started noticing with some of my patients what was happening for them. And a couple of examples. So I had a patient who was busy talking to me in the consultation room, and I'd been getting to know this person quite well, so I think there was a level of trust there. And partway through the consultation, I asked a question that was maybe a little bit more probing, to try and find out what was going on. And this person suddenly flipped into a different person. It was as if it was somebody completely different sitting in front of me, and they had a different facial expression and different mannerisms and a different tone of voice. And for the rest of the consultation, they were talking to me as that person, and so I had to adjust and communicate in a different way. And because I knew what was happening, I knew about it, I knew what was happening, I was able to recognize what was happening for that person. And then there was somebody somebody that I got to know, and she turned up at our house one day. And when she turned up at our house, this was a grown lady, she turned up at our house and she was talking and looking like about a 6-7-year-old. And she wanted some help with her coat, and she wanted to come in. She came in and she wanted orange squash to drink, and her tone of voice, her mannerisms, the way she held herself, how she responded to me, was as if she was 6 or 7. And what had happened was that something traumatic had happened in her life at that particular time, and it flipped her into trauma from her childhood, and trauma that happened when she was about the age of 6 or 7. And suddenly that's how she was presenting. So I took her home and got her settled down. The next day she couldn't remember anything about it. So something very specific had triggered this change. Now you can imagine that for her, if she was behaving like a 6-year-old at work, or with people who didn't know what was going on, or with her family, that's really difficult, really hard to understand, really hard to manage. And that's partly why I want to talk about it a little bit, because I think if we can understand why it happens and what happens, then we're more in a position to be able to help those around us who may have this and who need help, and be able to talk to them in an appropriate way and help understand them a little bit. Now, in terms of how to help people, in the surgery, I can refer into mental health services. To be perfectly honest, I try really hard for my patients to get them the help that they need, and psychiatric services, mental health services, are good at making a diagnosis. They can diagnose DID, and there's lots of therapy available, so talking therapies and CBT and different kinds of therapies that can help people with some of the issues around DID, medication that can help with depression and voices and all that kind of thing. But I haven't seen any of my patients in the surgery get completely well, completely whole, completely integrated again as a person. And that's really sad to me. People look for this help, and there isn't that much help. And part of it is because within medicine we don't fully understand what's going on, and we don't know what to do. We don't know how to help a person fully integrate again. Now, I have a friend called Carolyn Bramall, and she was severely abused as a child, something called SRA, or satanic ritual abuse. So it involved religious ceremony, it was a big group of people, it was repetitive abuse, severe abuse in childhood, part of a sort of paedophile ring that involved satanic religious spiritual stuff as well. And Carolyn has written her story in a book called Am I a Good Girl Yet? And Carolyn is a really brave, courageous, amazing lady who has been willing to be honest about what happened to her. So she had this severe abuse, she survived it, she survived by creating many parts, many different personalities to hold the pain. And she got into adulthood, she got married, she had children, and then things started to fall apart. And so she started to get some help. She had therapy for years, lots of different kinds of therapy, which was helpful and helped her manage, but she wasn't fully whole. And then she got in contact with an organisation called Freedom in Christ. And actually, I'm involved with this organisation, I have been for many, many years. And it was through Freedom in Christ that I got to know Carolyn. And she received help that was of a spiritual nature. So she started to understand that how this was an amazing creative thing that she'd been given, that she could form these different personalities. She started to understand that it was totally wrong what had happened to her and evil, but that she wasn't defined by it. That this awful thing that had happened, but actually who she was as a person wasn't defined by the awful things that had happened to her. And she started to understand who Jesus is, and how Jesus died and rose again for her. He died to take all the trauma, all the pain, and he rose again, so he overcame. And that she understood that she was a product of what Jesus did on the cross. That she could receive Jesus' life as a gift, and she was then a product of what happened, what he did for her, rather than a product of what happened in her childhood and this awful, terrible abuse that had happened to her. And she was able to connect with Jesus and receive healing, receive connection, receive identity, receive affirmation, receive truth. And over a period of months, she started to integrate, and the different parts of her personality were able to come back together again, because she had this different foundation in Jesus that enabled her to trust and to be in a safe place where all the parts were able to come back and join again, integrate again. And I suppose she didn't need them then. She didn't need the protection that they had brought her. So she was able to thank the different parts of herself for what they'd done for her, but then let them integrate. And Carolyn today is this amazing, whole, complete person who is just one person. And she's actually started a charity called Heart for Truth to help other people with DID. And she's seen many other people get whole and free through the work of that charity. I'll put some links to Heart for Truth on the website so that you can have a look if you'd like to. And I think Carolyn's story is just really beautiful because it gives hope. It gives hope that there is the possibility of integration and wholeness for people who've had such awful, terrible things that we can't imagine happen to them. And Carolyn was talking to one of the world specialists actually in DID, a psychiatrist, about her experience. And the psychiatrist said, you do know that people don't get whole. People can't. We manage people. We help people function as best they can, but they don't get well. And it's a delusion. What you're saying is a delusion. And Carolyn just said, well, it's the delusion has served me very well for 10 years now. And I'm very well and very happy. And for the psychiatrist, it was really difficult to understand what happened for her. And I guess that's where, faith, our faith in God, our faith in Jesus, if we choose to believe and receive the gift, then we have options open to us that aren't available when we're not aware of what Jesus has done, and that's an option for us. So I hope this has been helpful. Obviously, it's a really big, complex thing, and it's difficult to cover everything in a short talk like this. But I hope that just gives a flavour of DID and what it is and how it happens, and some of the ways that we can recognise it. And I'll put a link to resources so you can have a look and see if there's anything there that you think might be helpful to read more about. Carolyn's produced with Heart for Truth some really helpful practical tools for helping you if you're helping other people. So it's definitely worth having a little look at that.